Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat, and also if someone, oh, okay, I'll read the first one. With governments making climate change a partisan issue, how realistic is effective change in progress? What will it take for our leaders to set aside political/economic differences to pass major climate reform?
So governments don't make climate change a partisan issue, people do.
I would also add that climate change is a partisan issue mostly in the United States. Most countries in the world, it's not a controversial issue. It's, most countries, most politicians, and most citizens accept it to one degree or another, and it's not controversial. Whether or not they're able or willing to do much about it is another issue. But and there are climate deniers. There's some in Australia. There are some in Europe, but it's really the United States where it's a controversial issue, which is deeply problematic because the United States is by far the largest contributor in terms of per capita carbon emissions. So, and the second largest as a country, the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China, and as was just said in the previous question, the largest historically. So really that problem is almost a uniquely US based issue, that kind of climate denial on that scale.
It's also changing. So the large number of Republicans, that the latest polls are showing that Republicans are getting on board with maybe not the disagreement is about what you do about it, not so much that there's a problem. And there's still some concern about whether humans are denying the science, but in fact are many more are on board. And the question is going to be, what do you do about it? And part of that is reflected of the threshold that we've reached in terms of citizen engagement with the issue, which is greater than 60, somewhere between 60 and 80% of the U.S. public believes that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and we need to do something about it, and we're not doing it aggressively enough. And so politicians tend to listen to their constituents, and so the more that we get them to talk about it, the more that we change.
Yeah, elections have consequences, and this last election had a really nice consequence. You can see the impact, the difference in climate policy between the Trump administration, the Biden administration. And, Sherry was talking about public opinion. There's no, I'm hopeful that we just have to continue to elect leaders who take climate change seriously and mitigation of climate change seriously, greenhouse gas emissions seriously. And we have changed things on a dime, and we can continue to do that into the future.
Okay, I think we might just have time for one or two more questions. So this one seems very topical. Do any of you consider the possibility of an increase in pandemics due to climate change to be a threat? If so, what do you think is the solution to this problem?
So, an interesting fact about the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which was focused on climate research, going back to the 1990s, never talked about the connection between climate change and human health, because there was very little evidence about it. But that changed significantly in the last decade. And there are a lot of examples of the Zika virus and Lyme disease and all kinds of things that are happening. And so it is not surprising that there's going to be an increased connection between the pandemic and climate change, and the relationship between disease outbreaks and human activity, especially because of the connections with temperature rise and vulnerabilities and all kinds of other related health impacts. And so we have to deal with it. And it's one of the reasons why dealing with climate change and the pandemic simultaneously are a really important thing. What's the infrastructure? What's the health infrastructure? How do we deal with the hazards? How do we deal with the health delivery systems that are focused on health and not on on outcomes, not on prescribing medicines? And so it's a little bit that the solutions have to be looked at simultaneously. We have to really understand the nature of the vectors as well, because now there's much more global connection between people and all of the vectors of these diseases. And so it's a hugely important thing. Fortunately, the biologists are working on a lot of things like CRISPR and stuff that are probably going to help us find solutions a lot faster to dealing with some of these things. So.
Yeah, the linkage between disease in general and climate change is pretty close. Sherry mentioned vectors. Mosquitoes, different species of mosquitoes are vectors of dengue and malaria and Zika. And global warming is changing the distributions of these vectors. So you're seeing these diseases crop up in areas that they hadn't before.
Okay. Do we have anything to add to that question? It looks like I missed a question before that, so I just want to go back and make sure that gets answered too. How have you all seen Earth Days change over the years? Have you seen an increase in the number of people participating or a great sense of urgency in the last decade?
I can say something
for that many Earth Days.
I can say something about that. I mean, this is a question about environmental history, and we have a colleague, Sherry and I have a colleague in geography, Bob Wilson, who actually teaches a course on environmental history and is very interested in these kinds of things. I would say there's a tendency to think that activism around environmental issues is at an all-time high right now. And I think there's definitely a sense of urgency. But I think up until just a few years ago, the original Earth Day gatherings, the original Earth Day protests, and were the largest mass mobilization in the United States in US history up until I think this last year with the Black Lives Matter movement. I might be wrong about the exact, if Black Lives Matter brought more people out to the street, but the original Earth Day in 1972 was the largest mass gathering. And that was at a time of civil rights mobilization, of anti-Vietnam mobilization. So there was a lot going on at that time, but Earth Day was enormous at that time. And there was a lot of concern. At that time, early in the early 70s, it wasn't really climate change, but it was a lot of concern about pollution. This was at a time when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire multiple times, not just once, multiple times. Water pollution, air pollution. Think about Syracuse. Syracuse has Onondaga Lake. It was at one time in the mid 20th century, the most polluted lake in the country. And that's purely a function of just dumping uncontrolled chemical waste into the lake for decades. And so what that brought about, that happened in conjunction with mobilization, or the kind of a number of major legislation. So National Environmental Policy Act, which created the EPA, which created air and water quality standards, all of these things. So that was a huge one. And then you had, through the rest of the 1970s, through much of the 1980s, the Reagan era was a period of sort of retrenchment of sort of the neoliberal economic model, kind of more conservative, less concern for environment. The Reagan administration was openly hostile to environmentalism. And then you had in the early 90s, Sherry mentioned the Rio Conference, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in 1992. That was a different period of time, right? George Bush, the first George Bush, W's dad, who was Ronald Reagan's vice president, ran, believe it or not, as the environmental president in 1992. He was at the Rio conference along with other heads of state around the world. And he was, one of the big issues then was deforestation. It was not, climate change was on the agenda, but climate change wasn't front and center yet. It was really about deforestation and forest communities. That's when that 1992 was the year that I began graduate school. And all the talk was about indigenous populations and deforestation. Partly that's why I did my dissertation work in the Ecuadorian Amazon on indigenous communities and land rights and things like that. And so you had a lot of focus on wetlands, on deforestation. And then as the 90s went on and into the 2000s, the realities of climate change became front and center. And you have had since then another sort of resurgence of environmental concern, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily around climate change. So what you find, I think, if you look at kind of environmental mobilization, the history of that in the US and globally, is that there's these periods of activism, these periods where people come out, where they're really passionate, where there's a lot of mobilization around very focused issues. And then oftentimes it sort of goes quiescent and focuses on other things, but then it comes out. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this moment, because the stakes are higher now than I think they've been before, and for a lot of reasons. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this moment. But we're definitely in one of those moments, those peaks of environmental concern and environmental activism. But we've seen this before too.
But also, sorry.
Oh, just very briefly, Sherry. I'm sorry. I guess I don't know what how it compares to what it compared to historically, like what Tom was talking about, because I've taken, this is anecdotal, but I've taken these surveys in my classes for over 2 decades now here at Syracuse University. And 2 decades ago, I would ask students why they're in my ecosystem science class that we cover climate change. We always have. And very few of them, early on, it was because it fit into my schedule. Maybe there may have been one student talk about climate change. This year, every single student said that they were concerned about climate change and they wanted to learn something about it. So in that sense, I feel like you guys will be the engine to really make things change, hopefully, to get these leaders to do something. However, I noticed, I don't know if any of you looked at the Post-Standard this morning, so our local newspaper. There was one climate article. It was buried, last page of the front section. And so I'm not exactly sure at what point we're at in terms of public interest. I think the young people are interested. Certainly, I'm not sure about everybody else.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add is that I think that if you look at the Earth days from the early days till now, you'll find not the ebb and flow that Tom was talking about, also the age cohort of the people who were participating. It didn't, for a long time, there weren't a lot of young people concerned about this issue. And I think now, as Doug says, you own, I mean, unfortunately, we failed you. So yeah. You own this. And so people are concerned, especially when you get the IPCC coming out and saying we have about a decade to turn this around before we really are living in a very uncomfortably hot world. And it's a choice that we get to make. And so I think you all are feeling that and are much more activists. And that's a great thing. Just turn it into your votes too, to make sure that we continue to do the right thing.
Okay, I think that wraps up the time that we have. It was really nice having you guys. Thank you to everyone who attended today's Earth Day panel. We really appreciate your effort to learn more about a more sustainable future for our one and only planet. And a special thank you to our panelists for taking the time to talk to us today. If anyone wants to learn any more about the Restore Our Earth theme, earthday.org has a lot of great educational material, and other ways to help. But other than that, thank you all and enjoy the rest of your Earth Day.